On the morning of the 13th of December 1943, the temperature at RAF Marham in Norfolk had plummeted to -4 degrees Celsius. Ground crews worked with numb fingers, their breath crystallizing in the pre-dawn darkness as they prepared aircraft for what Bomber Command had designated a photographic reconnaissance mission over the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley. Flight Lieutenant Eric Ninham, a 23-year-old pilot from Croydon with 17 successful sorties already logged in his service record, stood in the briefing room studying the meteorological charts pinned to the wooden board. The weather officer delivered news that made several pilots shift uncomfortably in their seats. At 30,000 feet, temperatures would reach -56 degrees Celsius. The jet stream, that river of high-altitude wind only recently understood by Allied meteorologists, was flowing at over 120 miles per hour directly across their intended flight path. The mission itself was straightforward on paper. Photograph the synthetic oil facilities at Gelsenkirchen, then proceed to secondary targets at Essen if cloud cover permitted. Intelligence reports suggested the German flak batteries had been reinforced following the devastating raids of the previous month. But at 30,000 feet, the crews would be operating above the effective ceiling of most anti-aircraft fire. What the briefing failed to adequately address, and what would nearly cost Ninham his life within hours, was the effect of those extreme temperatures on the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines powering his aircraft. The de Havilland Mosquito assigned to Ninham that morning bore the serial number DZ414, a Mark 9 variant specifically modified for high-altitude photographic work. Her navigator, Flying Officer Bernard Catchpole, had flown with Ninham on 11 previous missions, and the two men had developed the kind of wordless communication that kept aircrew alive over hostile territory. Catchpole, a former mathematics teacher from Leeds, possessed an almost supernatural ability to calculate drift and ground speed in his head, a skill that would prove essential before the day ended. As they walked across the frozen grass towards their aircraft, neither man could have imagined that within 4 hours they would be fighting for survival in a situation no training manual had ever anticipated. The strategic context of December 1943 placed enormous pressure on RAF reconnaissance squadrons. The Allied combined bomber offensive, formalized at the Casablanca conference in January of that year, demanded constant photographic intelligence to assess bomb damage and identify new targets. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris had committed Bomber Command to the systematic destruction of German industrial capacity, but without accurate reconnaissance, the massive night raids risked striking empty fields or already destroyed facilities. Every photograph brought back by pilots like Ninham directly influenced the targeting decisions that would send hundreds of heavy bombers over the Reich. What made the Mosquito uniquely suited to this dangerous work was precisely what made it so vulnerable to the conditions Ninham would encounter. Unlike the lumbering Lancaster or Halifax bombers, the Mosquito carried no defensive armament for its reconnaissance role. Speed and altitude were its only protection. Stripped of guns and ammunition, fitted with enlarged fuel tanks and sophisticated camera equipment, the photographic reconnaissance Mosquitoes operated on a simple principle: fly higher than the enemy fighters could reach, fly faster than anything that could catch you, and trust the twin Merlin engines to bring you home. On the 13th of December 1943, that trust would be tested to its absolute breaking point, and Flight Lieutenant Eric Ninham would discover whether skill, luck, or something else entirely determines who survives when the impossible becomes reality at the edge of the stratosphere. The de Havilland Mosquito represented one of the most audacious gambles in aviation history. When Geoffrey de Havilland first proposed an unarmed wooden bomber in 1939, Air Ministry officials dismissed the concept as lunacy. Metal monoplanes with heavy defensive armament dominated military thinking, and the notion of building a combat aircraft from birch plywood and balsa wood seemed like a regression to the previous war. Yet de Havilland persisted, and by 1941 the Mosquito had proved its critics spectacularly wrong. The aircraft could outrun the Messerschmitt 109, outclimb the Focke-Wulf 190, and deliver a bomb load equivalent to the four-engine Boeing B-17, whilst requiring only a two-man crew. The secret lay in its revolutionary construction: wooden laminate fuselage sections, bonded with casing glue derived from milk protein, created a structure lighter than aluminium, yet remarkably strong. The streamlined airframe generated minimal drag, allowing those two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines to push the aircraft to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. For photographic reconnaissance work, specialized variants like the Mark 9 that Ninham flew carried 3 F-52 cameras mounted in the bomb bay, capable of capturing images from extreme altitude with sufficient resolution to count individual railway wagons in marshalling yards. However, the Merlin engine, magnificent as it was, harboured a critical vulnerability at extreme altitude. The 27-litre V12 power plant relied on a supercharger to compress thin air and maintain combustion above 20,000 feet. This supercharger, driven by exhaust gases in the Merlin 61 series, fitted to high-altitude Mosquitoes, required precise fuel-air mixture management. At 30,000 feet, where atmospheric pressure drops to roughly one-third of sea level values, the carburettor struggled to deliver consistent fuel flow. Tiny ice crystals could form in the intake system, gradually restricting airflow until the engine starved and died. RAF engineering officers understood this danger theoretically, but the practical solutions remained imperfect in late 1943. Carburettor heat systems existed, drawing warm air from around the exhaust manifolds, but activating them reduced engine efficiency and consumed additional fuel. Pilots flying long-range reconnaissance missions faced an impossible calculation: use carburettor heat continuously and risk running out of fuel over the North Sea. Conserve fuel by limiting heat application and risk engine failure over enemy territory. The official guidance suggested intermittent heat application at 15-minute intervals, but this recommendation was based on peacetime testing at lower altitudes and shorter durations. The Merlin 61 engines installed in Mosquito DZ 414 had accumulated 347 flying hours between them, well within acceptable service limits, but approaching the point where minor wear in fuel system components could magnify the effects of extreme cold. The port engine had received a replacement magneto the previous week, following an intermittent misfire during ground testing. Ground crews had signed off the aircraft as fully serviceable, and the pre-flight checks conducted by Ninham and Catchpole revealed nothing abnormal. The engines started smoothly despite the freezing conditions, their exhausts leaving trails of white condensation across the dispersal area. What nobody could see, and what instrumentation of that era could not detect, was the microscopic accumulation of moisture within the carburettor venturi sections. Water vapour, introduced during the previous day's maintenance when the cowlings were removed in relatively humid conditions, had condensed on cold metal surfaces. At ground level, this moisture posed no threat. But at 30,000 feet, in temperatures approaching minus 60 degrees Celsius, those invisible water droplets would transform into something far more dangerous, setting the stage for a mechanical failure that would test the absolute limits of human capability. Mosquito D Z414 lifted off from Marham's main runway at precisely 0742 hours, the winter sun still hidden below the eastern horizon. Ninham retracted the undercarriage and felt the aircraft surge forward as aerodynamic drag reduced, the airspeed indicator climbing steadily through 220 miles per hour. Beside him, Catchpole was already plotting their initial course, drawing pencil lines across the chart strapped to his navigation board. Their route would take them east across the North Sea, crossing the Dutch coast near Egmond aan Zee before turning southeast towards the Ruhr. Total flight time to target was estimated at 1 hour and 50 minutes, assuming favourable winds at altitude. The climb through the lower atmosphere proceeded without incident. At 10,000 feet, both men connected their oxygen masks, the rubber seals pressing cold against their faces. The Mosquito's cockpit heating system, fed by engine exhaust, struggled against the plummeting external temperatures, and Ninham could feel numbness creeping into his fingertips despite the heavy leather gloves. By 15,000 feet, the English coastline had disappeared beneath a layer of stratocumulus cloud, and the aircraft entered a realm of brilliant blue sky above a floor of pure white. The Merlin engines maintained their steady rhythm, the propeller governors automatically adjusting blade pitch as the air thinned. 20,000 feet brought the first indication that conditions were worse than forecast. The outside air temperature gauge, a simple mercury instrument mounted on the cockpit coaming, showed minus 48 degrees Celsius, nearly 10 degrees colder than the meteorological briefing had predicted. Ninham made a mental note to increase carburettor heat application frequency, reaching forward to pull both yellow knobs that diverted warm air into the intake systems. The engines responded with a barely perceptible roughness before settling back into smooth operation. At 25,000 feet, Catchpole looked up from his calculations with news that would complicate their return journey. The headwind component was significantly stronger than expected, suggesting the jet stream had shifted south during the night. Their ground speed had dropped to 260 miles per hour, despite an indicated airspeed of 310. Fuel consumption would be higher than planned, eating into the safety margin that allowed for diversions or extended combat maneuvers. Ninham acknowledged the information with a nod, knowing that turning back was not an option. Reconnaissance missions were considered so vital that crews were expected to press on unless mechanical failure made continuation genuinely impossible. The climb continued, the altimeter needle creeping past 27,000, then 28,000 feet. At this altitude, the sky above transformed from blue to a deep violet, the first hint of the stratosphere's edge. The Mosquito's airframe creaked and groaned as pressure differentials stressed the wooden structure. Sounds that experienced pilots learned to ignore, but which never entirely lost their unsettling quality. Catchpole reported crossing the Dutch coast 2 minutes behind schedule, the delay attributable to those unexpectedly strong headwinds. Then, at 29,400 feet, Ninham noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The cylinder head temperature on the starboard engine had dropped by 15 degrees over the previous 5 minutes, whilst the port engine showed a similar but less pronounced decline. This was wrong. At high power settings, engine temperatures should remain stable or even increase slightly. Falling temperatures suggested reduced combustion efficiency, which in turn suggested fuel starvation. He reached for the carburettor heat controls, pulling both knobs to their fully hot position. For perhaps 3 seconds, the engines continued running normally. Then, with a coughing splutter that Ninham would remember for the rest of his life, the starboard Merlin fell silent. The silence from the starboard engine lasted perhaps 2 heartbeats before the port Merlin followed it into oblivion. One moment, Ninham had 2,800 horsepower driving him through the stratosphere. The next, he had nothing but the whisper of wind across wooden wings and the distant whine of windmilling propellers The sudden absence of engine noise was almost physical, a pressure against the eardrums that seemed to amplify every other sound. The gyroscopic instruments began their slow drift as vacuum pressure decayed, and the aircraft's nose dropped as airspeed bled away without power to maintain altitude. Ninham's training took over before conscious thought could intervene. His left hand shot forward to the propeller pitch controls, feathering both air screws to reduce drag. Unfeathered propellers on a dead engine acted like massive air brakes, destroying glide performance and potentially sending the aircraft into an unrecoverable spin. The feathering motors, mercifully powered by the aircraft's battery system rather than engine-driven hydraulics, responded immediately. Both three-bladed de Havilland hydromatic propellers rotated to their minimum drag position, the blades aligning edge-on to the airflow. The physiological dangers at this altitude were immediate and severe. At 30,000 feet, atmospheric pressure is approximately 1/4 of sea level values. Without supplemental oxygen, a human being loses consciousness within 15 to 20 seconds. Ninham and Catchpole were breathing from onboard oxygen bottles, but these systems were designed for the normal mission duration, with engines running. Without electrical power from the engine-driven generators, the oxygen regulator's heating element would cease functioning, raising the risk that moisture in the system might freeze and block the flow entirely. There was also the matter of temperature. The cockpit, no longer receiving heated air from the engines, began cooling at a rate that transformed the enclosed space into a freezer. External temperatures at their current altitude hovered around -58 degrees Celsius. Within minutes, unprotected flesh would suffer frostbite. Within an hour, hypothermia would render both men incapable of operating the aircraft, even if they somehow remained conscious. Catchpole, demonstrating the composure that had earned him a Distinguished Flying Cross 3 months earlier, immediately began calculating their options. His navigation board showed their position as approximately 40 miles east of Eindhoven, deep within occupied Holland. The nearest Allied territory was the English coast, 180 miles to the west. The nearest emergency airfield was Manston in Kent, specifically designed for damaged aircraft, with its unusually long runways and extensive crash equipment. But could a Mosquito glide 180 miles without power? The mathematics were brutal but straightforward. The Mosquito's best glide ratio was approximately 15:1, meaning that for every foot of altitude lost, the aircraft could travel 15 feet horizontally in still air. From 30,000 feet, this translated to a theoretical maximum glide distance of roughly 85 miles. They were more than twice that distance from England. Even in the most optimistic scenario, they would run out of altitude somewhere over the North Sea, ditching in waters where survival time was measured in minutes rather than hours. Ninham processed this reality in seconds. Bailing out over Holland meant capture and prisoner of war camp for the duration of hostilities, assuming they survived the parachute descent in their current physical state. Attempting the glide meant almost certain death by drowning. Neither option appealed, and as the altimeter unwound through 29,000 feet, Ninham made a decision that contradicted every procedure he had ever been taught. He would attempt something that engineering manuals stated was impossible. He would try to restart both engines during the descent. The Mosquito entered its glide with an eerie grace, the airframe settling into a stable descent angle of roughly 4 degrees below the horizon. Without engine noise, Ninham could hear sounds normally masked by the Merlin's thunder: the creak of wooden spars under aerodynamic load, the whistle of air past the canopy seals, the scratching of Catchpole's pencil as he furiously recalculated their position. The aircraft was bleeding altitude at approximately 2,000 feet per minute, which gave them roughly 15 minutes before they descended into the effective range of German anti-aircraft batteries. Ninham understood the physics working against him. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, for all its brilliance, was not designed for air restarts at extreme altitude. The standard procedure for restarting a failed engine required diving to increase airspeed, using the windmilling propeller to turn the engine over whilst reintroducing fuel flow and ignition. But this procedure assumed a single engine failure with the other engine still running to provide electrical power and maintain cabin pressurization. With both engines dead, the electrical system was operating solely on battery reserves that would last perhaps 20 minutes. The carburettors presented the first obstacle. Ice had almost certainly formed within the venturi passages, blocking fuel flow entirely. This ice would not simply melt because Ninham wished it to. He needed heat, and with the engines silent, the only heat source was the residual warmth slowly dissipating from the exhaust manifolds. At minus 50 degrees external temperature, this warmth would vanish within minutes. The restart attempt had to happen quickly, whilst some thermal energy remained in the engine components. Below the aircraft, the frozen landscape of occupied Holland stretched towards the grey horizon. Ninham could make out the distinctive pattern of Dutch polders, the rectangular fields bordered by drainage canals that reflected the weak winter sunlight. Somewhere down there, German radar operators were undoubtedly tracking the unidentified aircraft on their screens, watching its steady descent with professional interest. Messerschmitt 109 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 26 were based at Schiphol, less than 50 miles north. If they scrambled interceptors, the powerless Mosquito would be utterly defenseless. Catchpole called out their altitude, 24,000 feet. They had descended 6,000 feet in 3 minutes, crossing into airspace where German fighters could comfortably operate. The navigator had abandoned his position calculations temporarily, instead digging through the emergency documentation stowed behind his seat. He found the engine manual supplement and rapidly scanned the restart procedures, searching for anything applicable to their unprecedented situation. Ninham made his decision. He would maintain the glide until reaching 18,000 feet, where atmospheric pressure increased to roughly half sea level values. At that altitude, the denser air might provide sufficient oxygen for combustion, and the relatively warmer temperature of minus 30 degrees might allow fuel to vaporize properly. He would unfeather one propeller, allowing it to windmill and turn the engine over, whilst priming the cylinders with raw fuel from the emergency boost pump. Then he would engage the starter motor and hope that whatever ice had formed in the carburettor had melted sufficiently to permit fuel flow. The procedure violated several established principles. Using the starter motor without confirmed fuel flow risked hydraulic lock, which could destroy pistons and connecting rods. Introducing raw fuel to cold cylinders risked fouling the spark plugs. And attempting a restart with depleted batteries risked draining the remaining power needed for radio communication and instrument operation. But these risks paled against the certainty of death if he did nothing. At 22,000 feet, still descending through enemy airspace, Ninham began preparing for an attempt that had never been documented in any training manual. At 18,500 feet, Ninham began the restart sequence. His fingers, now painfully numb despite the insulated gloves, reached for the propeller control lever on the starboard engine. He pulled it back from the feathered position, and the three-bladed air screw immediately began rotating as airflow caught the angled blades. The windmilling propeller created additional drag, accelerating their descent, but it also turned the engine crankshaft at approximately 400 revolutions per minute. This was far below the normal starting speed of 1,200 revolutions, but it would have to suffice. The priming pump required 8 strokes for a cold engine start, according to the manual. Ninham gave it 12, flooding the cylinders with neat fuel in hopes of overwhelming whatever ice remained in the system. Catchpole watched the cylinder head temperature gauge intently, calling out readings that showed the engine was still desperately cold. -12 degrees Celsius on the cylinder heads. The minimum recommended starting temperature was +4 degrees. They were operating so far outside normal parameters that the manual might as well have been written for a different aircraft entirely. Ninham switched on the ignition and pressed the starter button. The battery-powered electric motor engaged with a grinding whine, adding its torque to the windmilling propeller. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened except the continued unwinding of the altimeter. 17,800 feet, 17,600. Then, with a cough that seemed to shake the entire airframe, the starboard Merlin fired. The engine caught roughly, running on perhaps half its cylinders, the exhaust producing irregular bangs that sounded more like anti-aircraft fire than controlled combustion. Black smoke streamed from the exhaust stubs, evidence of the excess fuel burning off. Ninham's hand moved instinctively to the throttle, nursing it forward with the delicacy of a surgeon. Too much fuel would drown the struggling engine. Too little would allow it to die again. The tachometer needle wavered between 1,000 and 1,500 revolutions per minute, nowhere near the normal operating range, but sufficient to generate some power. The effect was immediate. The descent rate slowed from 2,000 feet per minute to 800. The electrical system flickered back to life as the engine-driven generator began charging. Most importantly, warm air started flowing from the exhaust manifold heating system, beginning the slow process of thawing the carburettor and warming the cockpit. Catchpole reported their altitude as 17,200 feet, position approximately 30 miles west of Rotterdam. They had crossed half of occupied Holland without power, and they were still alive, but one engine was not enough. The Mosquito could maintain altitude on a single Merlin under normal circumstances, but their current engine was producing perhaps 60% of its rated power, and fuel consumption at that inefficient setting would drain their tanks long before reaching England. Ninham needed the port engine running, and he needed it soon. He repeated the restart procedure on the port side, unfeathering the propeller and applying primer fuel with hands that trembled from cold and adrenaline. The starter motor engaged, drawing heavily on the partially recharged battery. This time the engine caught almost immediately, the cylinders firing in sequence with a smoothness that seemed almost miraculous after the starboard engine's rough awakening. Within 30 seconds, both Merlins were running, their combined roar filling the cockpit with the most beautiful sound Ninham had ever heard. At 16,800 feet, still descending but now under power, Flight Lieutenant Eric Ninham pointed the nose of Mosquito DZ 414 towards England and began the long journey home. The 2 Merlins were running, but they were far from healthy. The starboard engine continued to misfire intermittently, its cylinder head temperatures fluctuating wildly as damaged spark plugs struggled to maintain consistent ignition. The port engine sounded smoother, but was consuming fuel at an alarming rate, the mixture running rich to compensate for whatever damage the cold start had inflicted on the carburettor metering system. Ninham calculated they had perhaps 90 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption rates. The English coast was 75 minutes away at their reduced cruising speed of 240 miles per hour. Catchpole was already transmitting on the emergency frequency, his voice calm despite the circumstances. The high-frequency radio, powered once again by the engine-driven generators, crackled with static as he broadcast their position and status. Within minutes, a response came from the sector control station at Hornchurch. They had been reported missing when they failed to transmit their routine position update over the target area. Search and rescue aircraft were being recalled, and emergency services at Manston were being placed on standby. The return flight across Holland tested both men's endurance to its limits. German radar had tracked their descent and subsequent recovery, and Jagdgeschwader 26 had indeed scrambled interceptors from Schiphol. 2 Messerschmitt 109 G6 fighters climbed to intercept, guided by ground controllers who anticipated the crippled Mosquito's likely course towards England. Catchpoles spotted them first. 2 dark specks against the grey overcast, approximately 8 miles distant and closing rapidly. Ninham faced an impossible choice. A healthy Mosquito could outrun the Messerschmitt 109 at altitude, but his damaged engines could barely maintain 240 miles per hour. Diving would increase speed, but consume altitude he could not afford to lose. Climbing was out of the question with engines that might fail again at any moment. He chose the only option that offered any hope of survival. He pushed the nose down and dove into the cloud layer at 12,000 feet, sacrificing visibility for concealment. The next 20 minutes were flown entirely on instruments, the artificial horizon and directional gyro providing the only reference in a world of grey nothing. Ice began forming on the wings, adding weight and disrupting airflow over the control surfaces. The aircraft grew sluggish, requiring constant control inputs to maintain heading and attitude. Catchpole navigated by dead reckoning alone, his calculations accounting for estimated wind drift and compass deviation. They emerged from the clouds at 4,000 feet, somewhere over the North Sea. The English coast was visible as a dark line on the western horizon, perhaps 20 miles distant. Both engines were still running, though the starboard Merlin had developed a pronounced vibration that suggested bearing damage. The fuel gauges showed less than 15 minutes of flight time remaining. Manston was still 30 miles away, but the emergency airfield at Woodbridge in Suffolk was closer, just visible through the haze to the northwest. Ninham made for Woodbridge, transmitting his intentions on the emergency frequency. The airfield's 3,000-yard runway, the longest in Britain, had been specifically constructed for damaged bombers returning from operations over Germany. Fire tenders and ambulances were already positioning themselves along the runway as the Mosquito crossed the coast at 3,000 feet, both engines coughing and sputtering as the fuel tanks ran dry. The propellers began to slow, their bite on the air weakening with each passing second. Ninham had perhaps 2 minutes of power remaining and 6 miles still to cover. The final approach to Woodbridge tested every skill Ninham had acquired in 3 years of operational flying. The starboard engine died first, its fuel lines finally sucking air instead of petrol, the propeller windmilling to a stop as he feathered it for the last time. The port Merlin continued for another 40 seconds, carrying them over the airfield boundary at 800 feet before it too fell silent. The sudden quiet was different this time. Not terrifying, but almost peaceful, the sound of survival rather than impending death. Ninham extended the flaps and lowered the undercarriage, watching the green indicator lights confirm that all 3 wheels had locked down. The Mosquito's glide characteristics had been thoroughly tested during development, and pilots knew the aircraft could be landed safely without power, provided airspeed was maintained above 120 miles per hour until the flare. The massive runway stretched ahead like a grey ribbon, the fire tenders visible as red dots along its edges. The touchdown was firm but controlled, the main wheels kissing the concrete at precisely 115 miles per hour. The tail settled immediately, the wooden tail wheel absorbing the impact with a sharp crack that suggested it might not survive another landing. Ninham applied the brakes progressively, feeling the aircraft decelerate as friction overcame momentum. They rolled for nearly a mile before stopping, the canopy popping open to admit a rush of cold English air that smelled of salt and aviation fuel. Ground crews reached the aircraft within minutes, their faces showing a mixture of relief and professional curiosity. The intelligence officer who debriefed Ninham and Catchpole that evening recorded their account in meticulous detail, recognizing that the double-engine restart at altitude represented something unprecedented in RAF experience. The report was classified immediately, its contents shared only with senior engineering staff and flight safety officers. The investigation that followed revealed the precise mechanism of the failure. Microscopic ice crystals had formed in both carburettors simultaneously, a phenomenon subsequently termed sympathetic icing. The crystals had grown gradually during the climb, eventually blocking the fuel jets entirely. The restart had succeeded because the descent into warmer, denser air had partially melted the ice whilst engine heat completed the process. Had Ninham waited another 5 minutes before attempting the restart, the ice would have been too firmly established to clear. The incident transformed RAF high-altitude procedures. Within weeks, Bomber Command issued new guidance mandating continuous carburettor heat application above 25,000 feet, regardless of fuel consumption penalties. Engineering teams developed improved heating systems that became standard on all subsequent Merlin installations. The phenomenon of sympathetic icing was added to pilot training curricula, ensuring that future crews understood the danger and its prevention. Flight Lieutenant Eric Ninham received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on the 13th of December, 1943. The citation praised his exceptional airmanship and coolness under pressure, though the classified nature of the incident meant the full details remained secret for nearly 40 years. He completed a further 23 operational sorties before the war ended, surviving to return to civilian life as an engineering consultant. Bernard Catchpole continued flying as a navigator until 1945, eventually retiring to Leeds, where he taught mathematics until 1972. The story of Mosquito DZ-414 endures because it represents something fundamental about human capability under extreme pressure. When both engines failed at 30,000 feet, every logical calculation suggested death was certain. Yet a 23-year-old pilot, armed with training, instinct, and extraordinary composure, found a way to survive. Some victories in war are won with weapons, others are won with nothing but skill and the absolute refusal to accept defeat.